ready to dominate your pharmaceutical biotechnology exam. Today, we're doing a deep dive into two crucial antibacterial drug classes, sulfonamides and quinolones.
We'll break it all down for you, from their structures and mechanisms of action to their applications and even how resistance develops.
Like a supercharged study session, hitting all the high points, but in a way that really makes it stick.
It's fascinating stuff, really. These drugs completely changed how we treat bacterial infections.
And understanding how they work on that molecular level, I think that's key, not just for acing exams, but also for developing new therapies going forward.
Absolutely. It all starts with those fundamentals.
Okay, so let's unpack the first class, sulfonamides. They were a huge breakthrough in antimicrobial therapy. But what made them so special historically?
Well, you have to imagine it's the 1930s, right? Treatment options for bacterial infections were really limited.
Oh, wow, I hadn't really thought about it like that.
Yeah, and sulfonamides, they burst onto the scene and marked a turning point. It really ushered in a whole new era of antimicrobial therapy.
That's pretty remarkable. So it seems like understanding their structure is key to understanding how they work. What does a sulfonamide molecule actually look like?
Okay, so at the heart of a sulfonamide molecule, you have a benzene ring. Picture a hexagon, right, made of carbon atoms.
Okay, got it.
And attached to this ring, you have this kind of dynamic duo, an amino group and a sulfonamide group. Now, the sulfonamide group, that's where the action is. It's a sulfur atom double bonded to two oxygen atoms and also bonded to a nitrogen atom. That specific arrangement gives them their antibacterial punch.
Huh. So that's the secret weapon.
Exactly. And sulfonamide, the simplest one, its chemical formula is C6H8N2O2S. What's really fascinating is that part of this structure actually mimics something called para-aminobenzoic acid, or POBA for short.
PABA. Doesn't that have something to do with how bacteria make their food or something, like their metabolism?
You got it. Bacteria absolutely need PABO to synthesize folate, which is a vitamin, and that's essential for them to survive and grow.
Okay, I see where this is going. So the sulfonamides, they exploit this need, right?
Exactly. They're like molecular imposters, basically.
So they trick the bacteria somehow.
Think of it like this. Bacteria have this enzyme called dihydropteroate synthase, or DHPS.
Catchy name.
Right. And they need this DHPS to incorporate PABA into their folate synthesis pathway. But since sulfonamides resemble PABA, they can bind to DHPS instead.
Oh, so they block the real PBA from getting in.
Precisely, like a key fitting into a lock. PABA is the key, DHPS is the lock, and the sulfonamide is a decoy key that jams the lock.
Clever. So that stops bacteria from making folate, essentially starving them out, right?
Precisely. And here's the crucial part. Humans get folate from our diet. We don't have to synthesize it like bacteria do.
Okay, so that's why they target bacteria and not us.
Exactly. It's called selective toxicity, and it's a fundamental principle in drug development.
That makes a lot of sense. So they're bacteriostatic. They prevent bacterial growth rather than just killing them outright.
That's generally true, yeah. They stop the bacteria from multiplying, which then gives our immune system a fighting chance to clear the infection.
So it's teamwork. Now, what kinds of infections are typically treated with sulfonamides?
They're pretty versatile, effective against a whole range of gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. Think urinary tract infections, respiratory infections, even some protozoal infections.
UTI is definitely something a lot of people are familiar with. Are there ways to boost the effectiveness of sulfonamides?
Absolutely. You can combine them with another drug, trimethoprim.
How does that work?
Trimethoprim inhibits a different enzyme, dihydrofolate reductase, or DHFR, also involved in bacterial folate synthesis.
Oh, I see. So you're hitting them with a double whammy.
Exactly. You're setting up roadblocks at two critical points in the same pathway, cutting off those essential supplies. This combination is often bactericidal, meaning it actually kills the bacteria.
That sounds really powerful. But I have to ask, with all this talk about how well these drugs work, what about resistance?
You're right to bring that up. Bacteria can become resistant to these drugs. It's a major challenge in treating infectious diseases. We'll definitely get into that more a little later.
Looking forward to it. So what about how sulfonamides move through the body? What can you tell us about their pharmacokinetics?
Okay, so you take a sulfonamide orally, right? It gets absorbed from your gut into the bloodstream, and then it gets distributed throughout the body into various tissues and fluids.
So it can reach the infection site? That's good.
Exactly. And the liver is involved in metabolizing sulfonamides, breaking them down. And some of these broken down products, the metabolites, they actually still have antibacterial activity.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Then excretion, getting rid of them, that happens primarily through the kidneys.
Makes sense. Anything specific to keep in mind about the excretion?
It's really important to remember that sulfonamides, they don't dissolve very well.
Oh.
So if you're not drinking enough water, they can crystallize in your urine, and that can potentially lead to kidney damage.
Ouch.
So hydration is key when you're taking these drugs.
Good advice. Now, before we move on to the quinolones, let's talk about potential side effects. We talked about some issues that can come up with sulfonamides. What are we looking at here?
Okay, well, like all drugs, sulfonamides come with their own set of potential side effects.
Of course.
Hypersensitivity reactions are actually quite common, and they range from mild skin rashes to, more severe conditions like Stevens-Johnson syndrome, which is pretty serious.
Yeah, that doesn't sound good. Anything else to watch out for?
They can also affect blood cells, potentially leading to things like a granulocytosis or hemolytic anemia, although those are pretty rare. And then there's the renal toxicity risk, like we mentioned before, from crystalluria if patients aren't staying well hydrated. Plus, the usual suspects, gastrointestinal disturbances like nausea, diarrhea, those kinds of things.
So it really comes down to carefully considering these potential side effects when you're prescribing them, making sure you're monitoring patients closely.
Absolutely. Understanding their mechanisms of action, potential for resistance, how they move through the body and their side effects, it's all crucial for using them safely and effectively.
This has been incredibly helpful in understanding sulfonamides. Now let's dive into the world of quinolones, another fascinating class of antibacterial agents.
Now, quinolones, they offer a totally different way of fighting bacteria. They're like, molecular ninjas going straight for the heart of what makes bacteria tick their DNA.
Okay, I like that analogy. Let's break it down, starting with their structure. How are quinolones put together?
They have this really cool structure, two rings fused together. It's called a bicyclic structure. And this core, the quinolone ring system, is essential for their activity.
So it's this double ring system that gives them their bacteria fighting power.
Exactly. And here's where things get really interesting. Scientists can actually fine-tune these quinolones by adding different chemical groups onto this core structure.
I see. Like customizing a race car for optimal performance.
Perfect analogy. And one really important modification is adding a fluorine atom at a specific position on the quinolone ring.
And what does that do?
That creates a supercharged group of drugs called the fluoroquinolones.
Fluoroquinolones, I've heard of those.
Yeah.
Cipro, levocaine, right? Big names in the antibiotic world.
You got it. And that fluorine atom, it makes a huge difference. It boosts their potency, especially against gram-negative bacteria, which are notoriously tough to kill.
Wow, so they're the heavy hitters. Okay, we've got the structure down, but how do these DNA disruptors actually work?
Well, for bacteria to survive and multiply, they need to constantly be replicating their DNA, right?
Right.
And there are two key enzymes involved in that process, DNA gyrase and topoisomerase of Phe. Quinolones target those enzymes.
Oh, so they're going after the very machinery that bacteria need to make copies of themselves.
Precisely. Quinolones bind to these enzyme DNA complexes, and they prevent them from doing their jobs, unwinding and rewinding the DNA strands. It's like a tangled mess that can't be replicated.
So they're directly killing the bacteria, bactericidal.
Yeah.
Unlike the sulfonamides we talked about, which are bacteriostatic.
Exactly. And what's great is that these enzymes, they're specific to bacteria. So quinolones, they're generally safe for human cells. That selective toxicity we talked about with sulfonamides, it applies here too.
That's good news. So quinolones, they sound like pretty effective weapons against bacteria. But what about resistance? Can bacteria develop ways to avoid being taken down?
Unfortunately, yes. And this is becoming a huge problem worldwide, a serious public health concern. Bacteria, they're incredibly adaptable.
How do they do it? I mean, how do they resist these DNA disruptors?
Well, one way is by changing the very target the quinolones are going after. Bacteria can develop mutations in the genes that code for DNA gyrase and topoisomerase the Phe.
So they're changing the lock, so to speak, to keep the drugs out.
Exactly. Those mutations can change the shape of the enzymes, which makes it much harder for the quinolones to bind.
Sneaky. And these mutations, can they just keep building up over time?
Yeah, unfortunately they can, leading to higher and higher levels of resistance. Each mutation is like adding another layer of defense.
Wow, so they're getting tougher and tougher.
Yeah.
Are there any other strategies that they use?
Oh, absolutely. Some bacteria have these things called efflux pumps.
What are those?
Imagine, bouncers at a nightclub, right?
Yeah.
They're these proteins embedded in the bacteria's cell membrane, and they can actively pump the quinolones right out of the cell before they can do any damage.
So they're literally kicking the drugs out.
Yep. And then, of course, there's that horizontal gene transfer. The bacteria sharing those resistance genes, spreading the knowledge.
Swapping secrets on how to beat the system. It's an arms race.
You got it. And that's why understanding these resistance mechanisms, it's so vital. We have to find new ways to stay one step ahead.
Let's hope we are. Okay, let's move on to pharmacokinetics. How do quinolones move through the body?
Well, most quinolones are taken by mouth, orally, and they're usually absorbed pretty well from the gut into the bloodstream, but there are a couple of things that can mess with that absorption.
Ooh, like what?
Taking quinolones with certain other medications, like antacids or iron supplements, can actually reduce their absorption quite a bit.
Oh, I see. So it's important to know about these potential drug interactions.
Absolutely. And here's a weird one. Dairy products can also interfere with their absorption.
Really? So no cheese with your Cipro?
That's the general advice, yeah. The calcium in dairy, it can bind to the quinolones and reduce how much actually gets into the bloodstream.
Good to know. Once they're absorbed, where do they go?
Well, quinolones are kind of famous for their excellent tissue penetration. They reach high concentrations in a lot of different organs, the prostate, lungs, kidneys, even bone.
So they can really get to wherever that infection is hiding out.
Exactly. They can even get inside cells, which is super important for infections caused by intracellular bacteria like Legionella or chlamydia.
That's impressive. What about their metabolism and excretion?
Okay, so some quinolones are broken down by the liver. Others are excreted unchanged, but regardless of how they're metabolized, most of them are eliminated from the body mainly through the kidneys.
So having healthy kidneys is important for processing these drugs.
Absolutely. For folks with kidney problems, dosage adjustments might be needed to prevent the drug from building up and becoming toxic.
Makes sense. Okay, now let's talk about something I know patients always want to know about: side effects. We talked about some potential issues with sulfonamides. What about quinolones?
Well, like all medications, quinolones have potential side effects, and it's important to be aware of these and monitor patients really closely.
So what are some of the common ones?
Gastrointestinal problems are pretty frequent. Things like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal discomfort. They're usually pretty mild and go away quickly.
Okay, but anything more serious that we should be watching out for?
One concern is their effect on the central nervous system. Quinolones can actually cross the blood-brain barrier.
Wait, they can get into the brain.
They can, and that can cause headaches, dizziness, insomnia, and in really rare cases, even seizures.
So they can literally mess with your head.
In a way, yeah. But again, those effects are pretty uncommon. It's just something to keep in mind, especially for patients who already have neurological conditions.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Another rare but serious side effect is tendon rupture.
Tendon rupture. Ouch. That sounds really painful.
It is. And for reasons we don't fully understand, quinolones can actually weaken tendons, making them more likely to tear.
Wow. Is this something that everybody taking quinolones should be worried about?
No. Or if you've had tendon injuries before, those things can increase the risk.
And those are red flags.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that this side effect, it can actually happen even after you stop taking the medication.
Oh, really? It's not just an immediate thing.
Right. Patients need to watch out for any signs of tendon problems, like pain or swelling, and get to a doctor right away if they notice anything.
Good advice. Any other side effects that we should touch on?
Another thing, although less common, is peripheral neuropathy.
Peripheral neuropathy. What is that?
It's a condition that affects the nerves in your extremities, your hands and feet.
Okay.
Causes numbness, tingling, that kind of pins and needles feeling. And in some cases, it can be pretty debilitating, even irreversible.
That's scary.
Yeah. And then there's also a risk of photosensitivity with some quinolones. That means increased sensitivity to sunlight.
Oh, so you could get sunburned more easily.
Exactly. So sun protection is really important when you're taking those particular drugs. And finally, quinolones can interfere with blood sugar control, which is something to be mindful of for patients with diabetes.
So they could affect metabolism too.
Yeah, they can impact both high and low blood sugar. Careful monitoring is really important for folks with diabetes.
It seems like quinolones, while they're super powerful, they come with a pretty long list of potential risks.
That's true for any really potent drug. The key is using them the right way, knowing about the potential side effects, and keeping a close eye on patients.
That's good advice. This has been a really thorough exploration of quinolones. Ready for a quick recap before we wrap things up?
Okay.
Let's do that. Let's go back over those key points about quinolones before we finish up this deep dive.
Sounds good. So to recap, Quinolones are these synthetic antibacterial agents that are effective against a whole bunch of different bacteria, both gram-positive and gram-negative.
They're like the multi-tools of the antibiotic world.
Yeah, I like that. And they work by inhibiting bacterial DNA gyrase and topoisomerase AV.
Right, those crucial enzymes that are needed for DNA replication.
Exactly. And that basically stops bacteria from copying their genetic material, which leads to cell death.
So they're directly killing bacteria. They're bactericidal, right? Unlike sulfonamides, which we talked about earlier, which are bacteriostatic.
That's right. And importantly, they show that selective toxicity, meaning that they target bacterial enzymes without harming human cells too much.
That's a big deal for any effective antibacterial drug.
Absolutely. Now, when it comes to how they're used, quinolones are incredibly versatile.
We talked about how they can be used for UTIs, respiratory infections, skin infections, stuff in the abdomen, even sexually transmitted infections.
Yeah, they're real workhorses in the clinic. And that versatility comes from their awesome pharmacokinetic properties. They're well absorbed, they spread throughout the body, and they can even get into cells.
Right, so they're effective against a whole lot of different pathogens.
Exactly. But, as we've talked about, there are some downsides, mainly that bacterial resistance that's on the rise.
Right, that's a huge concern.
It is. It's an ongoing battle in the world of antibiotics. Bacteria are just so good at adapting, and they've come up with a bunch of ways to resist quinolones, like those mutations in the target enzymes, those efflux pumps that push the drugs out of their cells, and that horizontal gene transfer, where they share resistance genes with each other.
It's like they're always one step ahead.
Sometimes it feels that way. But that's why it's so important to understand those resistance mechanisms so we can come up with new strategies to beat them.
Couldn't agree more. On the patient side of things, it's super important to be aware of the potential side effects that can come with taking quinolones.
Definitely.
We've covered quite a few possible side effects, from gastrointestinal problems and those central nervous system effects to the risk of tendon rupture, peripheral neuropathy, photosensitivity, and even how they can interact with other medications.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that even though quinolones are powerful weapons in our fight against bacterial infections, we have to use them carefully and watch patients closely.
Well said. So we've explored two really important classes of antibacterial drugs, sulfonamides and quinolones, how they work, what they're used for, how resistance develops, and even the possible side effects. This has been a really great deep dive.
I agree. It really shows you how complex and constantly evolving the field of pharmaceutical biotechnology is.
What's the main takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with from this deep dive?
I think the most crucial message is that we have to use antibiotics responsibly. Overusing them and misusing them, that's what's driving the rise of antibiotic resistance. And if we're not careful, it could really undermine how effective these drugs are and push us back to a time before we even had antibiotics.
That's a scary thought. So we need to be smart about how we use these precious resources, and at the same time, we have to explore new avenues, like finding new drug targets and developing innovative therapeutic approaches to combat bacterial infections.
Exactly. We have to stay ahead of the curve in this constant battle against bacterial resistance.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the world of antibacterial drugs. It's been a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure, too. I always love sharing my knowledge about this amazing field.
And to our listeners, keep learning, keep those brains engaged, keep asking those important questions. There are so many exciting discoveries yet to be made in the world of pharmaceutical biotechnology. So until next time, stay curious.